In the history of how great powers fall, the final blow is rarely obvious. There is no declaration of defeat. No flag lowered. No single moment people can point to and say, this is when it ended. Instead, it begins quietly, with numbers that stop adding up. This is the story of how America's debt stopped being a tool of power and started becoming a weapon turned inward. For most of the 20th century, American debt didn't matter, because America wasn't just a country, it was the system. After World War II, the United States emerged as the world's factory, banker, and security provider. Europe was in ruins. Asia was rebuilding. And America held the gold, the industries, and the dollar. The Bretton Woods system locked the world into a simple deal. Trade in dollars. Hold dollars. Trust dollars. This gave the United States a privilege no empire before it had ever enjoyed. America could borrow in its own currency, and the world would finance it willingly. Deficits were not a weakness. They were a feature. America could import more than it exported, spend more than it taxed, fight wars without immediate consequences. Debt became invisible. But every financial advantage carries a hidden expiration date. By the 1970s, the math began to shift. Vietnam, social programs, and rising imports drained U.S. gold reserves. In 1971, the United States quietly broke the final promise backing the dollar. Gold was gone. The dollar became pure trust. To compensate, a new system was created, the petrodollar. Oil would be priced in dollars. In return, America would provide military protection. It worked spectacularly. Global demand for dollars exploded. And with it, America's ability to borrow without restraint. But this success planted the seed of dependency. Debt stopped funding productivity. It started funding lifestyle. Factories moved overseas. Consumption replaced manufacturing. Wall Street grew faster than Main Street. America didn't notice because debt kept the illusion alive. By the early 2000s, the United States had crossed a historic line. It was no longer the world's largest creditor. It was the world's largest debtor. Still, nothing collapsed. Markets stayed calm. The dollar stayed strong. Every American, whether they know it or not, lives under the shadow of a number so vast it's almost meaningless. It's not the score of a game or a population count. It's the national debt, an invisible force quietly shaping our nation's destiny. For generations, this debt was a tool, a symbol of American power. It funded wars, built infrastructure, and powered a global economy. A belief took hold, a dangerous one. America is too big to fail. But history has a ruthless way of dealing with that phrase. The real turning point wasn't a war or a spectacular crisis. It was something much quieter, much more relentless. Compounding interest. As the debt grew, the interest payments on that debt grew even faster. Year after year, more of our tax dollars were redirected. Not to new roads, not to scientific breakthroughs, not to our military, but just to servicing the decisions of the past. The debt stopped being a lever of power and became a fixed cost of survival. Today, the United States is approaching a financial situation that has brought down empires before. We see a debt-to-GDP ratio that just keeps climbing, permanent deficits even in times of peace, and an economy that relies more on confidence than on solid fundamentals. Sure, foreign creditors still buy U.S. debt, but the old enthusiasm is gone. Central banks around the world are starting to diversify their holdings. Global trade is slowly, quietly, moving away from the dollar. Alternatives are being tested. This is how trust erodes. Not in a sudden crash, but gradually, then all at once. But the most dangerous part isn't the sheer size of the debt. It's what the debt no longer creates. Borrowing used to build the highways we drive on, the industries that made us a superpower, the dominance that defined an era. Now it mostly sustains consumption, fuels speculation, and papers over political promises. That fundamental shift changes everything. Because when the interest payments start to rival military spending, when the world's creditors begin to quietly question repayment, when global confidence becomes conditional, that's the moment debt stops being about finance. It starts being about control. This is where history becomes uncomfortable. Because debt doesn't destroy nations by exploding. It destroys them by removing options. When Britain reached this stage after World War II, it still had an empire on paper. Ships, bases, influence, but every single decision had to be approved by its creditors. America is now entering the same psychological zone. On the surface, everything still looks incredibly powerful. The largest military, the deepest capital markets, the world's reserve currency. But beneath that shiny surface, policy is no longer about progress. It is about maintenance. Budgets are written not to build the future, but to prevent panic today. Each year, Congress argues over ceilings and shutdowns. Not because the solutions are unclear, but because every solution hurts someone immediately. Think about it. Raise taxes? Growth slows down. Cut spending? Social stability cracks. Raise interest rates? The cost of servicing the debt explodes. Lower them? Inflation eats away at your purchasing power. This isn't leadership paralysis, it is mathematical confinement. The system has become too large to reform without pain, and at the same time too fragile to absorb that pain. So leaders choose delay. And delay works until it doesn't. Meanwhile, something subtle is happening inside society. Work is losing its promise. Wages grow slowly. Assets grow quickly. If you own property, stocks, or businesses, debt inflates your wealth. If you don't, debt inflates your cost of living. This is how debt reshapes an entire culture. People stop believing that their effort will lead to security. They stop planning long-term. They stop trusting institutions that keep telling them, this is just temporary. This erosion of belief matters more than any balance sheet. Because reserve currencies are not backed by gold. They are backed by faith. Faith that the nation issuing the currency is stable. Faith that its politics are functional. Faith that its future output can cover today's promises. Once that faith weakens, the shift is fast. Creditors don't panic loudly, they rebalance quietly. Trade agreements change their language. Central bank reserves adjust their composition. International settlements start moving offshore. By the time the headlines notice, the momentum is already gone. This is why America's Suez moment won't look like a crash at first. It will look like a decision America is forced to reverse. A policy it cannot enforce. A threat it cannot fund. A moment where power is challenged and the response is hesitation instead of certainty, and that hesitation will be noticed. Markets don't need collapse. They just need doubt. Once doubt enters the system, the game changes for everyone. The question isn't whether a crash will happen, but whether the foundation of faith is already cracking. Have you ever wondered how empires truly fall? It's not always with a bang, a great battle, or a revolution. Sometimes it starts silently, with a number on a balance sheet. It's a story as old as history itself, the story of debt. Think of it as an invisible hand, quietly shaping the destiny of the world's greatest powers. Initially, debt is a tool. It builds roads, funds armies, and fuels growth. But over time, if it grows faster than the economy that supports it, something shifts. Borrowing, once a sign of strength, becomes a sign of necessity, and then it becomes conditional. The interest paid on that debt starts to sting, becoming punitive. Suddenly, the decisions of the past dictate the policies of the future. The conversation changes from, how do we prosper, to how do we just stay afloat? Empires don't crumble when they are poor. They begin to fall when they are over-leveraged and overconfident, a dangerous combination. America is not finished, not by a long shot. But the sun is no longer rising on its unburdened youth. History teaches us that this late afternoon phase doesn't last for decades. It often ends in a moment triggered by something seemingly small, a crack exposed by a financial tremor, and in hindsight, it's always remembered as sudden. When that moment arrives, the public debate will be loud. People will argue about politics, they'll point fingers at leaders, and they'll assign blame. But the real cause won't be in the headlines. It will have been written long before, in the cold, hard math. It's the story of debt that grew faster than trust. It's the story of interest payments that grew faster than national income. And it's the story of promises that grew far beyond the scope of reality. Just like every empire before it, America might discover that you don't lose power when the money is gone. You lose power when someone else starts deciding how much of your own money you're allowed to use. Once that power shifts, sovereignty is no longer absolute. It becomes a negotiation. This is the critical stage where a nation stops acting freely and starts acting defensively. Every move is no longer measured by what is best for the country, but by what will keep the markets calm. Foreign policy becomes less ambitious. Military strategy becomes more symbolic than assertive. Economic policy becomes reactive, constantly putting out fires instead of building for the future. You stop projecting strength and start signaling reassurance. This is the exact playbook Britain followed after the Suez Crisis in 1956. They still had a powerful military, global allies, and a rich history. But every international crisis ended the same way, with a nervous glance at their financial reserves and a quiet retreat from the world stage. America hasn't had to make that humbling call yet, but the preconditions are forming. Our ability to refinance debt now hinges more on global confidence than on our actual capacity to pay. Treasury auctions are successful because the world believes they have to be. The dollar remains dominant because the alternatives still feel incomplete. This belief is incredibly powerful, but it's not permanent. And what ultimately breaks it isn't a rival ideology or a political movement. It's simple arithmetic. When the interest on the national debt becomes the government's fastest-growing expense, policy choices vanish. When servicing that debt costs more than defending the nation, power becomes theoretical. The question we have to ask is not if this can happen, but when the math will demand its turn to speak.
Have you ever thought about national debt not as a number on a screen, but as an invisible hand, silently shaping the destiny of nations? It's a story as old as empires themselves, a quiet force that guides their rise and, eventually, their fall. It all starts when promises begin to outpace production. When a country promises more than it can create, it often turns to printing money. This isn't free money, it's a silent tax we call inflation. And with inflation, something crucial begins to die: trust. At first, people don't rise up in protest. They adapt. They start saving less because their money is losing value. They speculate more, chasing risky returns. They might even move their assets to other countries, seeking safety. They stop believing the official economic numbers. This is how a world reserve currency starts to weaken, not with a sudden crash, but with a slow, quiet migration of confidence. Remember, capital always leaves a country before people do. At the same time, the political system starts to seize up. Every necessary reform is labeled too risky. Every potential spending cut is deemed unacceptable. Every new tax is introduced as just temporary. This is how debt traps a democracy. It's not through military force, but by creating a web of dependencies where everyone has a reason to block change. At this point, leaders aren't really choosing new paths anymore. They're just managing the consequences of old decisions. And the most dangerous moment is when the illusion of control still exists, because that's when arrogance is at its peak, and humility is nowhere to be found. History is crystal clear on this. Empires don't collapse the first time they are warned. They collapse after being warned over and over again, while doing nothing to change course. Now, America today still has some major advantages that the British Empire didn't have at its peak. We're talking about massive scale, incredible technology, and more favorable demographics. But here's the catch. Advantages only matter if you use the time they buy you to reduce your risks. And debt is the ultimate thief of time. Every year of delay makes the system more fragile. Every new crisis just adds to the exposure. Every temporary fix just closes off future options. This is why the end rarely announces itself with a loud bang. It often arrives disguised as something else. A sudden policy reversal. A forced compromise. A moment where a leader has to explain why a long-held commitment wasn't worth it no more. And once that happens, it becomes easier for it to happen a second time, and a third. This is how real power erodes, one decision at a time, until backing down becomes a habit. Think about the Suez Crisis for Britain. The real lesson wasn't about humiliation. It was about dependency. Britain didn't lose that conflict because its military was weak. It lost because another power, the United States, held the financial leverage over it. Debt doesn't need to defeat you in a direct fight. It just needs to outlast your confidence. And when that moment comes for America, when it is forced to choose its own internal stability over its global authority, the world will finally understand what has already changed. It won't be the flag, or the army, or the powerful speeches. It will be the quiet realization of who truly gets to decide what America can afford to do next.
America can afford this only as long as the world believes it can. Because modern power is not built on factories or armies alone. It is built on confidence. The United States does not pay for its lifestyle with savings, it pays with promises. Promises that its debt will always be honored. Promises that the dollar will always be accepted. Promises that American bonds are the safest place on earth. For decades, those promises were unquestioned. Foreign nations recycled their trade surpluses back into U.S. Treasury bonds. Oil was priced in dollars. Global trade settled in dollars. Wars, welfare, and deficits were financed, not by sacrifice, but by borrowing. This created an illusion of infinite affordability. But history shows that reserve currency privilege is not permanent. It expires when math replaces faith. Today, the numbers are becoming impossible to ignore. America's debt is no longer growing because of emergencies. It is growing simply to pay interest on old debt. This is the same stage Britain reached before Suez, the same stage Rome reached before debasement, the same stage the Ottoman Empire reached before financial occupation. When interest becomes the fastest growing expense, the system stops serving the nation and starts serving the creditors. At that point, every policy choice narrows. Raise taxes and risk internal unrest. Cut spending and weaken global influence. Print money and destroy the currency's credibility. There is no painless option. And then comes the moment every empire fears, the moment when creditors stop asking if and start asking when. When a single crisis is enough to expose reality, a failed intervention, a debt ceiling standoff, a loss of confidence overseas. That is the Suez moment. Not announced. Not voted on. But enforced by markets. Because empires don't fall when they are attacked. They fall when they can no longer pay. And when that happens, collapse doesn't take centuries. It happens suddenly. Thanks for watching. If history, money, and power matter to you, subscribe for more documentaries like this.